Welcome to another episode of the Spotlight Podcast. My today's guest is Richard Machin. He is a senior lecturer at Nottingham Trent University. He is a social policy scholar and policy analyst with a national and emerging international reputation. There are two key components of his scholarship identity. The first is as a teacher of social policy. In this role, he has a reputation for high-quality teaching, as evidenced through the peer-reviewed awards, which are a catalyst for change in students. This reputation has led to a wide academic portfolio. He teaches on modules across 3 departments at undergraduate and postgraduate level. The second element of his scholarship expertise is his role as a policy analyst. Drawing on strong, practice-based experience in local government, he has an established reputation for a quality policy analysis on a range of emerging societal issues. Today we will speak with Richard about homelessness and food insecurity in the United Kingdom. If you like our content, please consider subscribing. Richard, welcome to the Spotlight Podcast.
Thank you.
Tell me a little bit about your background.
I suppose I've had an interesting journey into academia. I've worked at the university level for around 10 years. But before that, I spent a lot of time in local government, managing welfare rights and debt advice services. So very much my academic interests are linked to my professional experience, particularly around the social welfare sector in the UK. So I'm interested in the systems we have in the UK, how people are marginalised and treated by systems in the UK around poverty-related issues. It's interesting, we've had a few conversations prior to the podcast, and I was thinking about my longer-term journey to academia. Going back all the way, thinking about family background, I think is important. So both of my parents worked in the public sector. My dad was a primary school teacher and then a head teacher. One of his real passions was making sure that all of the kids in his school had a really decent level of reading ability before they went to high school. And he worked in some really mixed schools where that was a challenge. And that was his passion. And I could see him as a kind of public servant. And my mum was a hospital social worker and then went on to specialise in bereavement counselling and became a really kind of prominent expert in the UK in bereavement counselling. It was interesting when I speak to my mum. She was at university in the 1960s, and it was unusual that her father, my grandfather, really encouraged her as a woman to follow her professional ambitions. He really encouraged her to be a strong woman at a time when really there wasn't a pathway or many role models for women. And I guess why I've reflected on these early days for me, my family background, is I think the things that have always been important to me when I worked in local government and I worked in academia have probably come from my family. And in particular, I'd say that from those early experiences, my family encouraged me to focus on 2 things. One of those was around the way we treat other people, our interactions with other people. And I think I've always carried that. Now, of course, we kind of let ourselves down and we make mistakes, but I think that to me is really important, how we relate to people on a one-to-one basis. And the other thing is to really try and identify how people in society are marginalised and oppressed, to try and look at the way that systems work against people in society.
But I wanted to ask you this, Richard. Why bother? You have a very nice life, as you just explained. Why bother? Why do we talk about societal issues, social policy?
It's a good question, because you're right. I have come from a comfortable background.
Exactly.
You can see I'm one parent as a teacher.
Chill out, have a nice life.
Got a nice life. So one reason I think that I'm becoming increasingly aware of, that I think has had an enduring impact on generation after generation in my family, is that this commitment to social justice comes from a faith-based background as well, and from a Methodist perspective. Now, for me, I do have a faith, and I'd say I've not necessarily had a traditional journey, and my journey towards having a faith is non-linear. But Methodism at its core is about social justice. So if we think about the Methodist tradition, very instrumental in prison reform, very instrumental in the abolition of slavery. In more recent terms, the Methodist Church has campaigned really strongly on poverty-related issues, around the Jubilee 2000 campaign, Drop the Debt. So I think for me, there's something in my family and that has been partly influenced by faith, that has kind of created this commitment to wanting a society that is fairer for everybody, and not seeing society as something where we're just in it for ourselves, not just about pursuing individual gain, but seeing actually a society that works well is fair for all people and creates opportunities for all people.
I was thinking to talk about the homelessness in the UK and the food poverty. When I came in October 3rd last year, I was stunned by how many homeless people, rough sleepers, are in Nottingham area in particular. And I've seen a lot of them in London. Why is this such a huge issue in the UK, Richard?
We're in a really interesting moment in time, I think, and your observations are absolutely crystal clear. We have a huge homelessness problem in the UK, and we also have a general affordable housing problem in the UK. Those two things are linked.
Can you differentiate, because it seems we have an equal sign between a term like homelessness and housing issue? And the other day I was thinking about it. We have a climate change and we have global warming. I kind of connect these two phenomena. You know, when we want something to sound as it should be and send the message, we say homelessness as an issue rather than housing problem.
There is a distinction, although the two things for me are related. So you, when you arrived in the UK, could observe very clearly. You didn't need to go to the university library or to start reading lots of papers around this. You can see it with your own eyes. So if we look at that first, that homelessness problem that there is in the UK, manifests itself most clearly and most regrettably in terms of rough sleeping when we can see people on the streets. So what is going on in UK society that creates that rough sleeping? So we, for sure, over the last 10 years, there has been an increase in rough sleeping. And of course, politicians, policymakers often debate around how we calculate the size of a social problem, how can we actually ascertain how many people are rough sleeping. But there is no doubt, even if we start quibbling about the exact numbers, there's no doubt we've seen this huge spike in rough sleeping.
Whichever methodology we use,
we
have a clear picture. There is a huge issue in the UK in the past 10 years in particular.
Absolutely. So it's interesting that we're sat here as a general election has just been called, Parliament has now been dissolved. So we can see at the end of this Parliament, officially, and we'll maybe come back to what the official figures mean because they're so misleading, officially there are 4,000 people who are rough sleeping in the UK.
Okay.
Now, We'll hold our suspicion around that for a second and come back to the figures. Now, this current government have had 5 years in power, and they committed to ending rough sleeping, and they've failed to do that. In 2010, so if we go back to that kind of period, 12, 14 years ago, the official statistics were that there were around 2,000 rough sleepers in the UK. So over that period of time, it's doubled. So the question is, what has been going on in UK society?
According to the official statistics.
According to the official statistics. So I think there's a lot of things that have been going on. So there's an increase in vulnerability for many groups in society. And I think that's connected to a number of things. It's connected to a lack of affordable housing. And we can unpick what that means.
Yeah.
And it's also linked to income-related issues.
Okay.
So people not having enough money in the pocket and people not being able to afford housing. So those two things are absolutely key.
How important is to really understand the root causes and societal ramifications of housing issue in the UK at the moment?
So what we can see in the last 10 years is that there's been this momentum behind what's sometimes described as housing being seen as a commodity rather than a need. And that might sound a little bit like their academic terms or it's waffle, but this is absolutely key. That I think in the UK, we have stopped seeing a house as a need, as a basic need, and it's been seen as a commodity on the market. So why might that increase homelessness? Why does that create a vulnerability? So we can see more and more people in the UK are having to rely on the private rented sector. So the private rented sector in the UK is becoming much more popular or the main choice for people. Why is that a problem? So we've seen over the last 10 or 12 years a huge increase in rent, the price of rent, so rent's becoming unaffordable for people. We've seen a huge increase in the number of evictions from rented property because there's a lack of control. So private landlords, now I don't want to sit here and criticise private landlords as a whole group. There's a lot of really excellent private landlords, but there are intrinsic problems with the private rented sector.
At least with the relation between private landlords and the client.
Absolutely. So we can see overall this increasing reliance for people on the private rented sector. While rents are high overall compared to the social rented sector that we'll come to in a moment or two, conditions are worse, disrepair is worse, and it is really easy in the UK for a private landlord to evict a tenant and to increase the rent. So we've got that instability in the private rented sector. Now, when I started working in local governments 25 years ago, many more vulnerable people lived in what we call in the UK the social rented sector. So by that, we mean accommodation provided by local councils and housing associations. And we've seen a massive decrease in that type of accommodation. The implications for that are really significant because overall, the rents in the social rented sector are much lower, the conditions are better, and it is much more difficult to evict a tenant from the social rented sector. So there's much more security. So we've got this real imbalance at the moment where we've got a shrinking social rented sector. That sector is shrinking, and overall, we can see that sector is characterised by more security and lower rents. And we've got an increasing reliance on the private rented sector, where there's less security, higher rents, and it's much easier for private landlords to evict people.
Please give us a little context to this whole story. How do we end up in this situation? I do remember you from classes talking about even from a Thatcher, Reagan era, and how Margaret Thatcher basically said, this is the time in which every English person will have his own castle, his own apartment, his own house. How do we end up from that point to here?
It's interesting because when I was born in the 1970s, we've got about a third of the population were living in social rented housing. So it was a kind of very, very mainstream type of accommodation. So the 80s was a critical turning point. You're absolutely right to raise that. So what we saw in the 1980s during Margaret Thatcher's premiership was the right to buy policy. And what the right to buy policy meant was that people who were living in social rented property were given the option to buy those properties at a discounted value. And it's really interesting because I don't want to sit here and criticise that in its entirety as an approach. You'd mentioned that there was this really strong move that Thatcher had, that she said everybody should have the right to own their own home. So Britain being a nation of owner-occupiers, why shouldn't everybody in society, regardless of status or income, have the opportunity to own their own home? And that is a very strong argument. It appeals to people, and I understand that. And you said at the start, rightly so, I come from a comfortable background. My parents own their own home, so why shouldn't that be an opportunity across the board? So that I understand. And it was a very popular policy from the Thatcher administration. Really, really popular in terms of being a vote winner, this right to buy policy. So I've been saying for a few minutes, there's a lot of merit to this. There's a lot of positives to it. Where does the rub and where does the tension come? So the right to buy policy was hardwired into that, was supposed to be a commitment that for every property that somebody bought, local councils were supposed to build or buy a one-for-one alternative property so that the overall supply, the overall number of houses in the social rented sector did not decrease. Yeah. Now, that's never happened. What's happened is that the right to buy policy has meant lots of people in social housing have bought their own properties. Local authorities, councils have not been able to have this one-on-one replacement of properties. So we've seen that general shrinking of the social rented sector, the general decline, meaning now that the social rented sector is a small sector in the overall housing composition in the UK. And that there are huge waiting lists for people to be able to get social housing.
So it's literally impossible.
Virtually impossible. So very, very long waiting list. Often people waiting for months, and often longer than that for years. So yeah, that hopefully that gives some interesting, fairly recent historical context that the overall mix of housing supply has really changed in the UK.
In the aftermath of the 2008 financial crisis and the austerity measures that you already touched on, how we have this situation change?
From the 80s and 90s, we were seeing the reduction in the number of housing in the social sector, housing association and council properties. I think what's happened in the UK, the trends that we can see since the financial crash, is that has been the response in the UK has been austerity measures. So we've had governments who have argued that the way we need to respond to global financial pressures is to reduce public sector spending. It's interesting that you've asked me to firstly talk about the reduction in social rented sector and then the response to the global financial issues, because they've run side by side. Austerity measures. So austerity gets used as a term. For me in the social welfare sector, what's been the impact? So the impact has been a reduction in funding for public sector services that are disproportionately relied on by the most vulnerable people. So that's council services, libraries, children's centres called Sure Start centres in the UK. And also a massive reduction in support provided by the welfare benefit system. So cuts to social security that's available to people. So we've got this double whammy where we've got this trend where more and more people are having to rely on the private rented sector, but also running alongside that is a real squeeze on public sector services and a squeeze on people's incomes. So people are relying on the private rented sector where there's a lot less regulation, higher rents, much more easy for a private landlord to evict someone. At the same time as austerity measures have meant for a lot of people, they have less money in their pockets. There's been certainly for people relying on social security, payments have been cut, not kept up with inflation. But even people in work, wages haven't kept up with inflation. So we've got these parallel problems of a squeeze on income and a really different kind of pattern of housing that's available to people.
And it seems now, let's say we have a Brexit and a cross-section analysis of the numbers. So I pulled something here. It says, homelessness has threatened 73,000 households. At least one member has a full or part-time job. Can you tell me, now in the active workforce, we have a huge problem. Every fourth household is in danger, and in certain 90 or 120 days, they may become homeless.
This is, again, a new feature that I wouldn't have expected to be so prominent when I started in my career in local government. So I think it's really interesting that you're identifying in-work vulnerability, someone who's come to the UK in the last 12 months. When I started working in local government, supporting people in the UK who I'll describe as vulnerable. I know some people perhaps don't like the word vulnerable, and we could talk about why that is, but I'll use the term vulnerable because people will understand what I mean by that, I think. We would maybe see older people who are on a fixed income. We might see some people with disabilities who perhaps were out of work. We might see people who were rough sleeping, been vulnerable. But what's going on now to create this in-work vulnerability? The most obvious response to that is that wages just aren't keeping up with market costs. So people's income from wages is so stretched that it isn't meeting the basic cost of living. Housing is a really important part of that. But I guess so are those other essentials around utilities, around clothing, around food. People are having to, of course, people have to prioritise keeping a roof over their head, and then other areas of those budgets get squeezed. So yeah, we can see for sure that it again is an income-related issue. Poverty is complex, but it comes down ultimately to a lack of income. It is also, I think, about the pattern of work sometimes that people can get stuck in. So it can be about 0 hours contracts, people not having a regular income, people having interruption in their income. And then it is for sure about people having to spend very high percentages of their wages on rent, on those housing costs, on utilities, and then that creates a squeeze for those other things like food, like clothing, like childcare.
What could be done to respond to this huge issue, Richard?
That's the tough question. But I think what is really interesting is, I guess I'm at the age in my life where there's a risk that you look back and you think things when you were younger were better.
To kind of reflect.
To reflect. There's a risk, and I'm probably going to fall into that trap.
Yeah.
But
there is a bias. I'm not sure. Looking backward type of bias.
Yeah, absolutely. However, it's interesting that when I reflect on these trends, and I discuss this in the classroom with students, there are some features of UK society which are quite new, and it's easy to forget that. So in the last 10 years, we've moved to this position where there's this spike in homelessness. But also we've said it's not just about rough sleeping and that most extreme form of homelessness. There is this massive increase in general housing insecurity in a more general sense. So there's something that's been going on in society that hasn't happened by accident. We're at a really interesting time with the general election and a new government of some form or another we will see in the next few weeks. So what I would say to that new government is a number of things. It is about housing supply in part. That means the UK doesn't build enough property and it doesn't build enough social housing. So that certainly would be one way that we could start to alleviate some of these issues. So that massive decrease in houses available in the social rented sector has been accompanied by a lack of new build. So that would be one tangible policy initiative that there needs to be genuine momentum behind. The reason I say genuine momentum is politicians across all the political parties often talk a really good game about new builds and the need for a programme of new build, but actually the record in terms of delivering that is really poor.
Massively, yeah.
That isn't the only issue, though. There needs to be some very significant changes in the private rented sector as well. So what do I mean by that? The reality is the private rented sector is always going to remain a really important part of the housing picture in the UK.
And quite difficult to control, though.
Difficult to control if there's not the political will. And that is the key to all positive change that we could see in the future. The private rented sector doesn't need to be a place of insecurity for hundreds of thousands of people. And there are a number of ways, fairly easy, I would say, that in terms of policy or legislative change that would create more security for people. So the first, we could see that there was a move to ban what's described as no-fault evictions. So this has been, I'm sure you've seen, debated in the UK media. So there are some processes which a private landlord needs to go through in order to evict someone from a private rented property.
Exactly.
But there are accelerated processes, and it is really easy for a private landlord to evict someone.
At the moment,
including this kind of idea that with the phrase no-fault eviction, if I'm a private landlord, you're my tenant, you might have been living in my property for 8 months, I decide for any reason...
All of a sudden you want to increase...
I don't... You looked at me the wrong way yesterday. You just annoyed me. So I've decided I now want you to leave my property. I don't need to provide a reason for you. I don't need to go to a judge in a court and persuade the judge that you've been a poor tenant, or that you're in rent arrears, or that you're an antisocial tenant. I can just do that. It might be I want my kids to move in. It might be I'm selling the property. It might be just I've decided I want.
Or you simply ask for twice as much.
Yeah, or I ask for twice as much. So there needs to be further regulation of the private rented sector. And that needs to tighten up so that private landlords cannot evict so easily. And the point that you just made there is also absolutely critical. We can see it's really easy for private landlords. Again, there are some rules around this, but overall, it's really easy for private landlords to increase the rent. Now, we see in countries like Germany where there are much tighter rent controls. So if you're my tenant and you've signed a tenancy agreement, then there should be much tighter restrictions on how and why and by the amount that I can increase your rent. In the UK, it's far too easy for me to just say, Yanko, your rent, I'm just going to increase that by £200 this month. There's a news item on the BBC News website this morning with a young woman who has talking about this very problem she's had. She's living in a private rented property. She wants to start a family, so she needs a property where there's enough room in that property for kids. Private landlord increased the rent by £200 a month. She can't afford to stay there. She's going to move to somewhere that's smaller. So there needs to be that regulation in the private rented sector alongside the expansion of the social rented sector. And if we bring this down to the personal experience that I think is really important, that for so many people, housing is just becoming a kind of nightmare in the UK, that it's hard to find decent, affordable property, and B, even if you're in decent, affordable property, the goalposts can be moved so quickly because the dynamic of power rests with the landlord, who can quickly increase the rents or could evict you without providing
any particular reason.
Yeah, and I think that needs to change. And that to me is not a radical position. That's not a position where I'm saying people shouldn't be able to derive an income from being a private landlord. I understand that, and that's absolutely fine. But there needs to be changing of the balance that we have in the UK, so it's not creating vulnerability for many people.
Before I ask you about the reflection and teaching about these very important subjects at NTU, can you tell me about some successful examples globally? You already mentioned Germany. I read the other day and came across the video on YouTube about Finland. Finland is quite successful. There is a person, Juha Kahila, if I'm not mistaken, he mentioned 3,000 permanent built housing solutions for homeless people.
It is interesting, and I think we can get so subsumed, so bogged down in UK-based issues that actually there are these really good examples internationally that we should look to. So to me, some of those things that we've just talked about, changing the balance in the private rented sector, it seems like a kind of no-brainer to me.
Like
it seems absolutely obvious, because that's creating a vulnerability for people who do have a roof over their head. They might not be homeless, but that's creating that vulnerability. In terms of homelessness policy and how we might alleviate that, you'd mentioned some of the experience from a country like Finland that has used an approach called housing first.
Housing first. Before this was a staircase model, but they're already doing it for 11 years, Richard.
Doing it for 11 years and doing it for that length of time because it works. So what we generally see in the UK is that over a period of 20 or 30 years, homelessness legislation has created, as you said, this kind of staircase or these barriers, where actually, if we are trying to support someone who is rough sleeping in Nottingham, their problem, in one sense, is obvious. They need somewhere to live. The route in the UK to take someone from being in a position where they're sleeping rough to being in a position where they're in suitable, secure accommodation is very convoluted, because we expect people to jump through hurdles based on the law that says, can you prove you've got the right immigration status? Can you prove that you're in priority need? Can you prove that you're not intentionally homeless, that you haven't done something that can be seen as willfully contributing to that? So that's the general position in the UK, that the policy creates this all of these hurdles.
Hi, Daniel Blake.
Yeah. So we've kind of many people listening will have seen that film, where actually policy for me should be about alleviating those issues rather than reinforcing them. The Housing First model works on the really simple premise: if you're homeless, what you need is a roof over your head and you need support. So rather than having a very convoluted system, often people in the UK, we've got over 100,000 people are stuck in often really poor standard temporary accommodation before local authorities can move people into more secure accommodation. Housing First says that's unacceptable. You're homeless. The most suitable, appropriate response is to immediately find someone accommodation. That's their most pressing need. And then once that accommodation has been secured, some of that vulnerability is already going to be being removed or alleviated. And then we will start working at some of the other issues that you might be experiencing. You've got a roof over your head. That's one issue that's been alleviated. What else might be going on for you? You might need to claim welfare benefits. You might need help with your mental health. You might need help with addiction. But what I'm not saying to you is you need to resolve all of those problems, and I'm going to tempt you by saying, sort out, Janko, all of those issues: mental health, welfare benefits, addiction, and I'm going to dangle over here in a few months' time, or maybe 12 months' time, accommodation. That's not how people's lives work. It's about providing that accommodation. So in essence, that's the Housing First model. It does rely on having accommodation properties to move people into. And that's why we've already discussed the importance of new builds and having enough accommodation.
Some pessimists or rather alarmists would say in the UK, but the UK has this very specific situation, cannot be easily applied, these models from Scandinavia. What do you have to respond to them? So
I think it can be. There are examples. Andy Burnham, the mayor of Manchester, is very keen on this model, and that has been found to work. So I think maybe it does need to start on a small scale and then can be scaled up. But I think we've seemed to me to have reached a position in the UK where policymakers are very short-sighted and only look at things in a kind of very blinkered way without looking at the fundamental causes of vulnerability and without trying to seek solutions that actually, in the short but certainly in the long term, resolve or certainly really reduce some of these issues that we've got. So rough sleeping for me, we talked right at the start of our conversation about my values. Rough sleeping is a kind of, should be a national outcry, but even if people don't feel that same passion around it being a disgrace that we've got a homeless issue in UK society, there is a cost to people being on the streets. Clearly there's a human cost to the rough sleepers, but there's a cost to the public purse in terms of criminal justice, in terms of health, in terms of antisocial behaviour, in terms of mental health and addiction. So I would say we can't afford to have a society where we've got thousands of rough sleepers. We can't afford to have a society where people can't afford to feed themselves. That to me is not sustainable. So that's where we need, it might seem like it's a very bold change to have a program like Housing First, but that is what we need to be investing in. And
it's interesting you mentioned elections, upcoming elections. How important it is to have a broader consensus that whoever is in power follows the previous government footsteps that we all can agree upon. Like, this is no rocket science. We know what we need. We need to agree on this. And whoever is in power, we're going to prioritize these issues.
Yeah, so we are in an interesting time. And I think there is a lack of vision across the political spectrum to tackle some of these issues we've been talking about. And that really does disturb me that we haven't got that vision in society. So, for example, we've got the current opposition party, the Labour Party, who seem to be very tentative, saying they're going to maintain a lot of the present government's financial commitments, spending commitments. I think what we need is some proper vision that's going to benefit society as a whole. Certainly it's going to benefit the most vulnerable. So what do I mean by that? We need a vision that we have a society where we don't need food banks, where rough sleeping is eradicated or is at a level that is completely minimal. We need to have a vision where children aren't living in poverty. And I think most people in society across the age range, where you live in the UK, do support those visions. But I think we need to come back to politicians talking in those terms. When you've got those headline visions, you can then work backwards and think, well, what policies can we put in place that would realise those ambitions? And they're never going to be perfect, and they're never going to work to kind of 100%. They're never going to have a perfect outcome. But that's what is lacking for me at the moment. It is those kind of visions. And we need, I think, to hold the next government to account on these issues about what sort of society do we want.
Yeah, I need to reiterate as many times as possible, but Finland has been doing it for 11 years, Richard.
Yeah.
We need to have a consistency of the policy in place. You just mentioned food poverty. Can you please make a parallel? Okay, we are shifting from homelessness to food poverty. Again, you don't need to go to library or university to realize there's all, these food banks from London to southeast, west of England.
If we were having this conversation 10 years ago, food poverty wouldn't even be on the agenda. So again, what has happened in recent times over the last decade that means hundreds of thousands of people in this country are relying on food banks, are what might be described as food insecure. So there are definite parallels with the vulnerabilities we've talked about in terms of housing.
You're not among them, I'm not among them. How do you feel about this, what you just said, Richard? We need to come back to feelings and emotions.
Yeah. I think it's an interesting point, and this is something that I do discuss in the classroom. I feel that a position of privilege, and I think we should acknowledge that position of privilege. But what we then shouldn't do is to think we're in this position of privilege because we have done something so we deserve to be here. And I think that is one of the key things that I work with students to think about, is we have, I think, often in the media and policymakers want to encourage an idea of individual deficit. So you're right, we aren't experiencing food poverty. Is that because we're smarter? Is it because we don't deserve to be? Is it because we've made better decisions? No. It's about systems that we're just fortunate to be a position within that system that we're not food insecure. But we need to have a more kind of respectful society where we have an understanding that people have been pushed to food insecurity because of systems and policy.
Can you tell me, in relation to the homelessness, how do you think that food poverty can be fixed? And is there an easy fix again? And amongst the major stakeholders, which are the other institutions involved besides food banks? Can you just give us a little clearer picture?
So I think it is worthwhile. We've talked about homelessness, but now we're kind of moving on to food poverty. Those two issues are related. So when we look at poverty and vulnerability, of course we want to hone in and focus on particular aspects, but we do need to look at the broader picture. So there are definite parallels between food poverty and homelessness. So for the next government, if I was to sit here with whoever the next Prime Minister is and say, it should be seen as a disgrace that there are food banks in the UK, and these are my suggestions for what you need, how that can be resolved. It is about work, in part, and it's about understanding that many people who use food banks are in work. So we can sometimes, I think, look, or the media wants to encourage us to look at people who use food banks and think that's people who are unemployed, that's people who are claiming social security. That isn't the full picture. Many people are in work. So we need to look, policymakers need to think about the national minimum wage. Is the national minimum wage at a high enough level? They need to look at things like 0 hours contract and precarious work and put in regulations to create meaningful work that actually pays enough for people. Social security. There are some really obvious things that the new government could do, which would have a significant, not the nuclear option to end food banks, but would have a very significant impact. Ending the 2-child limit, ending sanctions, making sure that people who claim disability benefits are paid at a level that actually relates to the cost of disability. Housing is related to food banks because people often use food banks not just because they can't afford food, but because people have to make a choice. Your income this week or this month is not going to cover all of your expenses, so you have to prioritise. You this month decide you're going to prioritise your rent or paying for children's school uniform, so then you need to use a food bank. So it's looking at those issues that we've talked about of trying to reduce housing insecurity. And then I think there are issues for particular groups in society. So often there's a real vulnerability for people leaving prison. And we need to look at the support mechanisms that are in place for those really vulnerable transitions. We need to look at the discharge grant that people have when they leave prison. We need an honest conversation about letting asylum seekers do permitted work. Many countries have that's hardwired into the system. And also, just kind of thinking about why are so many people in the UK vulnerable, thinking about mental health and health problems generally. People don't want to be in a position where they're not able to engage in society. But often that is because people have got health problems, aren't able to work. So we need to look at those systems of support around mental health and around the health systems as well.
I wanted to ask you about the response on an individual versus collective level. We do have these fancy terms, collective commitment, collaborative engagement. How important they are in improving food scarcity
So for me,
because we speak about government on various levels, state, regional, local, and then we kind of touch on the individual. But now, what about the collective engagement?
I think what's interesting around the food bank movement and the increase in food banks is that we might have a picture in our head of what a food bank looks like. And a food bank might look like you've not got enough food for you or your family for this week. So you go to a food bank and you rely on a donation of food. Actually, that is a quite simplistic way of looking at what happens at food banks. And I think we do need those systemic changes that I've outlined. We do need those policy changes that start, hopefully quickly, to reduce food poverty. But also, the general support that is provided to people, I think, needs to be a lot more joined up. So food banks already are doing this, but I think we need to think about how we can provide hubs for people where it's not that you come and see me at a food bank and I give you a carrier bag of food. It's that we've got a centre where someone is able to receive some support, maybe with childcare, maybe with education, maybe someone can access mental health services, maybe someone can get some careers advice. Now, what that takes is a vision, again, that people's lives are complex. We don't just have one need around food or housing. We've got needs around our mental health. We have needs around our children. We have needs around our work. And we need a much greater funding of services through local governments to be able to meet those needs, but to work in a much more joined up way. So that's where I'd see that kind of collective response. And one of the people that I've talked with in the teaching sessions that I've had with you and I refer to in a lot of my teaching is the work of Michael Marmot, probably the most preeminent public health expert in the UK. And he talked about when we look at a society, we can judge how well society is doing by looking at the health and well-being of individuals and the population as a whole. And if we accept, as I think we have to, that for many people, on an individual but collective level, health and well-being is a real problem, then something is going wrong in society, and that needs a whole society response. So I don't know if that answers the question around some of that balance between the individual response, but that collective response that we need.
So for the very end, I have two last questions for you. The first one would be just to reflect on teaching in relation to these subjects like food poverty and housing issue. And you can also differentiate between the undergrad kind of domestic students and international students that you have as a prevalent in your postgraduate courses.
Yeah. I've been working in higher education for 10 years, so it's been a really interesting time to work in universities in the UK. Also a really difficult time in one sense to teach social policy because there've been all of these really difficult issues going on in society, this increase in deprivation and vulnerability. So you are right, there's sometimes a difference between undergraduate teaching and postgraduate teaching. I think with undergraduate students, there are a couple of things that I really try and emphasise that we've kind of touched upon a lot in this podcast. That is that it isn't inevitable to have a society that is scarred with high levels of rough sleeping, of homelessness, of child poverty and food poverty. And it's kind of interesting often when in a September when I start teaching students, 18-year-olds, they've never known anything any different. And that is where it's one advantage of getting a little bit older that I can see back in time when things were better, where we had child poverty figures moving in the right direction, where we didn't rely on food banks, where we weren't walking through the streets of this city and there were rough sleepers on every corner. So that's one thing that I really try and emphasise with undergraduate students. What is going on in society?
The safety net was kind of wider and thicker.
The safety, absolutely, and I really like that picture of the safety net. And this is a welfare state. The UK has a welfare state, and we need to think about how that can be better, how we can bolster that. The other two things I think with undergraduate students to really emphasise, we talked about that dynamic and that continuum around people who experience life in a really vulnerable, hard way in the UK. To what extent is that down to systems? To what extent is that policy driven? And to what extent is that driven by individuals, circumstances and perhaps individual choice? And I think that's a question that not all undergraduate students have fully considered. And of course, yes, we all have our own agency, we all make our own decisions, but actually we know this is a society that is driven by inequality, that is driven by hierarchy. And really to explore with students, sometimes based on their own experience, sometimes based around the placements that they might have, that actually this really isn't a level playing field we have in the UK. And to really work with students to understand the impact of policy on individual lives and to move away from that individual deficit. There's that kind of academic term of othering people, to see people as different. And the other thing that I really encourage students to think about, and they can see this in practice, and this comes back to some of those things I talked about with my family background. We've discussed this, Janko. You've said to me, how can we crack the system? I can feel powerless as an individual, as a student, as an academic. There are all of these problems we're discussing in the podcast in this nice room. How can we have a positive change? How can we try and influence change? So there are all of those policy-related issues that are really important that we campaign on, that we hold people in positions of power to account on. But there is something else that I think is really important. And I talked about we all have that choice about how we relate to other people. We all have a choice about how we interact with other people. And in a professional setting, that's really important, I think. So I can think of dozens of service users I've worked with. If you say to me, have you been able to change the system so their lives are fundamentally different? The answer to that, honestly, would oftentimes have to be no. I've not been able to change their housing status overnight or change what the social security system is. But there is something else that I genuinely think is really important. And that is working with people who are at the harsh end of policy in a way that they understand that it's not their individual deficit that has created that situation. And it's not around poor decision making or that they're making the wrong choices in society. And I think that is really important. I can see this with service users, that they understand you are working alongside them, that you are not judging them. And it isn't always that you've been able to facilitate a brilliant outcome, but there is something in working alongside someone in a dignified human way that when the systems are against people, they can see, Janko, you've given me the time and space, you've treated me with respect, and you've understood and heard the problems that I have, and you have clearly related that that is not an individual deficit. That is the way that systems and policy work. And that is powerful. That is powerful. And maybe I might sound naive in that, but I truly believe that that is important. I sometimes worked with service users where we might not have won an appeal when we're trying to secure them extra social security benefits. We might not have been able to prevent that eviction, but the way that we relate to people on that individual basis is kind of really important.
Just listening to your story, I just realized that we were all, at a certain point in our lives, Daniel Blake. So I cannot stress enough how important it is to for everyone to watch the movie. Before we finish, can you please tell me about the personal independence payment and your last paper on it and why it's so critical? And we can wrap it up.
Thank you. So, as you know, I'm really interested in the UK disability benefit system, of which personal independence payment is a really important part. So we do, in the UK, have a disability benefit system, which is designed overall to try and provide some support for people who have a disability or a health-related problem to compensate, if you like, for the extra costs associated with that. And so, for me, it's a positive that the UK has that disability benefits provision, but it needs to be far better. It needs to, so the personal independence payments system needs to actually reflect the reality of disabled people's lives, both in terms of the value, the amount that it's actually paid at, but also in terms of the assessment processes are often really difficult for people to navigate their way through. Often I have a real interest in personal independence payment for people with mental health problems. So often we can have a real tick box exercise where you might come to me with struggling with a mental health problem, and it's a very rigid system. It's based on points. It's based on filling out a really convoluted, long-winded form. And so my real interest is trying to influence the reshaping of the disability benefit system so it actually reflects the reality of people's needs in terms of their health, and it also then is paid at a level which reflects people's costs. And part of that is something that I've thought about a lot in recent times. I'm not motivated. I want to have a position in UK society where less people are claiming disability benefits. It's not desirable to have an increase in the number of people claiming disability benefits. So it's interesting that when the government are saying it's unsustainable to have hundreds of thousands of people claiming personal independence payment, in one sense, I would agree and say it is unsustainable. We shouldn't have very high numbers of people claiming disability benefits. However, the response to that isn't just about cutting provision. It isn't about reducing the level of support. It's about thinking, why are people needing to claim disability benefits in the first place? And this comes back to some of those broader things that we've talked on in this pod around why are we living in a society where people aren't able to work? Why are we living in a society where there's an increasing level of mental health issue? Why are we in a society where people are struggling to access the health support they need? So it's about looking, for me, policymakers need to look at things in a much broader way.
So Richard, thank you so much for giving us the opportunity to talk to you today about these extremely important issues for our society.
Well, thank you. And it's interesting that I can discuss this with you coming to the UK and seeing some of these issues. And
from the perspective of an international student.
From one of the most interesting elements of my job is working with international students. And in lots of ways, the conversation we're having in this pod is a continuation of some of the discussions that we have in the classroom. And the reason for that is, this has really struck me over the last 3 or 4 years, and you've certainly been a part of this, Janko, is I have this interest and expertise around the social welfare system in the UK. And it's interesting, I hope, to discuss that, to debate that with international students. And what has become so apparent in the last few years is people have come from all over the world to study at NTU, often with an idea of what UK society is like, often with an idea of what UK democracy is like, the UK welfare state is like. And I can sometimes feel uncomfortable that I think I've burst the bubble for a lot of people, that I feel I want to do that in a balanced and respectful way, not to just be pushing my own agenda, but to shine a spotlight on where things don't work in the UK. And it's really interesting to get an international perspective. It's really valuable for you to come to me from outside the UK and to push me on these issues. But also to see we do live in a connected global world, and where can the UK learn from these conversations we have? How can the UK improve the fabric of its society based on what is happening in other countries? And maybe in the future, things will improve in the UK, and the students in my classroom will be returning maybe after their study and saying, these are the things we can take from the UK that work for the advantage of people who are vulnerable. Because at the minute, unfortunately, I think the international students I'm working with are having a semester worth of teaching and thinking the UK isn't working. The way that UK policy is delivered isn't working, and we need to avoid replicating that in our own countries. And I really hope that changes. We can see things do move in cycles, and I'm ultimately hopeful. I'm ultimately hopeful because I see the enthusiasm and the compassion of students that I work with. And the things that we've described today are policy driven. Food poverty is not inevitable. Homelessness is a political choice. And that's why I think these conversations are important, to try and unpick why those things have occurred and to think about how we can halt and change that. And I do think there is certainly a cause for real hope about that, because it's in our hands to change that.
Exactly.
So, yeah, I've enjoyed our conversation. Thank you.
Thank you so much once again.